At that point, Dolbear woke up. He yawned loudly, lifted his heavy lids, and his blue, bright eyes opened wide under his red brows. He had been audibly sleeping for a long while, but we were used to the noise, and it disturbed us no more than the sound of a kettle simmering on the fire. "What have you got to say to that, Raymer?" he asked. He shot a sharp glance at him, but Raymer made no reply. Dolbear yawned again. "I'm rather on Nick's side," he said. "Certainly about the first chapter in this case." "Well, that was read at the beginning, before you settled down for your nap," said Loudon. Dolbear grinned. "But it was not that chapter in itself that interested me," he said. "I think most of the discussion has been off the point, off the immediately interesting point. The hottest trail that Nicholas got onto was the discord, as you said yourself, Harry. That's what you should follow up now. I should feel it strongly, even if spaceships were as regrettably possible as the transatlantic bus service. Michael, your real story is wholly out of keeping with what you called the frame. And that's odd in you. I've never felt such a jar before, not in any of your work. I find it hard to believe that the machine and the tale were made by the same man. Indeed, I don't think they were. You wrote the first chapter, the space voyage, and also the homecoming, rather slipshod at that, and my attention wandered. You made it up, as they say. And as you've not tried your hand at that sort of thing before, it was not much above the average. But I don't think you wrote the story inside. I wonder what you've been up to." "What are you driving at?" said Jeremy. It was typical Raymer all through. Nearly every sentence was hallmarked. And even if he wanted to put us off with borrowed goods, where could he have got them from? "You know his itch to rewrite other people's bungled tales," said Loudon. "Though certainly he's never tried one on us before without telling us." "I know all that," said Jeremy, hopping about angrily. "I mean, where could he get this tale from? If he has found any printed space travel story that I don't know, then he's been doing some pretty hot research. I've never met anything like it at all." "You're missing my point," said Dolbear. "I shouldn't have said wrote. I should have said made up, invented. I say again, I wonder what you've been up to, Raymer." "Telling a story," answered Raymer glumly, staring at the fire. "Yes," said Dolbear, "but don't try to do that in the nursery sense, or we'll have to roast you." He got up and looked round at us all. His eyes looked very bright under bristling brows. He turned them sharply on Raymer. "Come," he said, "come clean. Where's this place, and how did you get there?" I don't know where it is," said Raymer quietly, still staring at the fire. "But you're quite right. I went there. At least, well, I don't think our language fits the case. But there is such a world, and I saw it once." He sighed. Welcome. I'm Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, and this is The Forge of Tolkien. What had Raymer seen? So, in last episode, we talked about Tolkien's desire to write a time travel story, and I told you how The Lost Road was completely lost. Tolkien never finished it, although there is more to it than I read to you. But he tried again, and he tried again, and in trying again, he gave rather more of the mechanisms that he was thinking about when he was writing The Lost Road in the first place. He mentioned this trying again in a letter to Christopher that he wrote December 1944, and it's sort of frustrating for us understanding where Tolkien is getting this part of his work, right? Because he's even more hedgy about what he was up to. He says, "This morning I saw CSL for a while. His fourth or fifth novel is brewing, and seems likely to clash with mine, my dimly projected third. I've been getting a lot of new ideas about prehistory lately, via Beowulf and other sources of which I may have written, and want to work them into the long-shelved time travel story I began. CSL is planning a story about the descendants of Seth and Cain. We also began to consider writing a book in collaboration on language, nature, origin, functions. Would there were time for all these projects." Well, sometime later, July 1946, he mentions this other project, in a letter to his publisher, Sir Stanley Unwin. Again, at this point, Christopher has explained to us Tolkien had been working on, his father had been working on The Lord of the Rings, and when he wrote Christopher in December 1944 about wanting to write this third novel or something, this other story, while C.S. Lewis is, galumphing on publishing number 4 and 5, he was about at the end of The Two Towers. So again, we have this is like the background humming along of Tolkien's thinking as he's writing The Lord of the Rings, which is why it's relevant to us, trying to understand The Lord of the Rings, but also trying to understand Tolkien's process and the kinds of invention that went into writing The Lord of the Rings. And in the passage I just read to you from our text for today, we have Dolbear challenging Raymer on where he got it, right? What has he been up to? You made up that frame, which is an interesting accusation, but the other part you didn't, right? And so we're trying to play off of Tolkien's exercises and where he thought his own stories were coming from, and you get a little hint there with, I've been getting a lot of new ideas about prehistory lately via Beowulf and other sources of which I may have written, and want to work them into the long-shelved time travel story I began. All of this exercise in going back in time that he set up in The Lost Road, he's still puzzling over, he's still worrying over it. And he tells Unwin, among other things, right, he's working on a variety of things, right? There's always layers and layers of whatever Tolkien's working on, but he concludes the letter by saying, I have, by the way, published a story in verse in the Welsh Review of December 1945. I'm about to publish a much expanded version of an essay on fairy stories originally delivered as a lecture at St. Andrews in a memorial volume to the late Charles Williams. And I have, in a fortnight of comparative leisure round about last Christmas, written 3 parts of another book, taking up an entirely different frame and setting what little had any value in the inchoate Lost Road, which I had once the impudence to show you, I hope it is forgotten, and other things beside. I hoped to finish this in a rush, but my health gave way after Christmas. Rather silly to mention it till it is finished, but I'm putting The Lord of the Rings, the Hobbit sequel, before all else, save duties that I cannot wriggle out of. So again, we have the verse poem that he publishes is the Lay of I'm sorry, I don't know this one. Just let me double check the letter, the name. The Lay of Autru and Ytron, which we will get to, because Tolkien's always layering, on fairy stories, which is often used as the introduction to what Tolkien was up to in The Lord of the Rings. But we see that he's working on all of these other things and rewriting the on fairy stories. We don't have the original version in the published version. We have this revised one, so we'll get to that. And at the same time, he's revising this frame story to try to do his time travel narrative again. Well, the frame of the frame of the frame is delightful. For those of you who are familiar with the history of Middle-earth, what we're reading today is published in Sauron Defeated, which is volume 9 of the history of Middle-earth, and it includes some of the history of the Lord of the Rings, but it also includes the Notion Club papers. Now, the Notion Club papers are, I think, in microcosm, the best evidence that we have for exactly how many layers of framing Tolkien thought would be necessary to make someone believe that you'd actually traveled in time. Or is he doing this kind of framing exercise to make you believe he's traveled in time, or to make himself believe that it's possible to travel in time? Well, what would that look like? What would a scholar do to travel in time? Well, you'd go to the library, right? You'd go to the library and you'd find a lost manuscript, right? And so we have in the Notion Club papers, leaves from the Notion Club papers, a foreword which explains how we come to have these Notion Club papers in the first place. Well, what are the Notion Club papers? These papers have a rather puzzling history. They were found after the summer examination of 2012. on top of, we know that he's working on this in 1944 to 1946, right? And he's projected that this bundle of papers is going to be found in the future in 2012 on top of one of the number of sacks of waste paper, as if we were still using paper in 2012, in the basement of the examination schools at Oxford by the present editor, Mr. Howard Green, the clerk of the schools. They were in a disordered bundle, loosely tied with red string, the outer sheet inscribed in large Lombardic capitals, the Notion Club papers. And he gives you a sample of these unseals. And Mr. Green notices them, opens them up, and finds out that nobody owns them. Nobody can find out who they are, and that they are, in fact, minutes or reports covered probably about 100 meetings or nights during the years of last century, approximately 1980 to 1990. Okay, so first we have the premise that this bundle of papers is found in 2012. And that it, in fact, contains records of meetings of a club, although we can't find any evidence of such a club existing. Papers that no such a club appears ever to have existed. So there's the sort of premise of the fiction of, well, did it exist or not? And it's nightly meetings from 1980 to 1990 with a particular author, Nicholas Guildford, but, and this is still from the preface, Mr. J.R. Titmuss, some of Tolkien's names are more convincing than others, right? Mr. J.R. Titmuss, the well-known historian of 20th century Oxford, who has given all possible assistance to the present editor, has shown that this is certainly a fictitious name and derived from a medieval dialogue at one time read in the schools of Oxford. And that is true, right? It's The Owl and the Nightingale, which was written probably the late 12th century, early 13th century, and in the it's a debate poem, and in the debate the owl says that things should be decided by the master, Nicholas Guildford, who is, as Christopher explains, the Nightingale replies, the master, Nicol of Guildford, is the obvious choice to decide the debate, since he is prudent, virtuous, and wise, and an excellent judge of song, right? So the joke is, one of those obscure academic jokes that people like me love. Those of you who go to Kalamazoo will know that this is exactly what we play at in the Pseudo Society, which is held on Saturday nights, and people always have found, the lost manuscript that now solves the problem that we've all been trying to figure out, lost letters of Abelard and Eloise or something like that. So here we have Tolkien wink wink nudge nudging at his own readership, presuming a scholarly Oxford readership would know that Mr. Titmuss is telling you the completely obvious. But it turns out that although the original bundle of papers probably included meetings from 100 nights, it's like 100 is a very interesting number of chosen. It's like the Dantean scholars will recognize this, or maybe actually I had just thought of this. Maybe it's Pearl and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and you're playing with 100 stanzas, not the Divine Comedy. In any case, it used to have a fullness of record, 100, but we actually only have now nights 51 through 75, assuming that bundles for nights 1 through 25, 26 through 50, and 76 through 100 were made elsewhere and have now been lost. So we only have the middle third of these descriptions. And so here the editor, Howard Green, is pretending that he's published everything that he found, but there was more, right? Which is a not unfamiliar experience when you're reading medieval sources, that we only have a portion of them, and Tolkien would have been familiar with that problem from his own scholarship. But this is, what we have here now is not the first edition that Mr. Howard Green made, but the second, right? And so we have a note to the second edition now having established that this record of meetings is incomplete and found in 2012. There's a second edition, which is in fact published in 2014. I was amused by this because that was one of the years that I taught Tolkien in my campus class, and so it's like, look, we found them this year. So this second edition was they've done some more study of the paper on which these records were kept, and Mr. W. Wormold of the School of Bibliopoly and Mr. D.N. Barrow of the Institute of Occidental Languages found their curiosity aroused by the published extracts and asked Mr. Green for permission to examine the manuscripts of the papers. And they go through this elaborate description of saying, oh, the paper was old, right? So, in fact, probably dates to the period during or just after the 6 Years' War. So now, in other words, World War II, that Tolkien is imagining that because the paper that he used to write the Notion Club papers was actually paper from 1944 to 1946, that when the later scholars examine the paper for which these Notion Club recordings are made, they find out that in fact it's older paper, and then they do this elaborate hypothesis of we conclude the Notion Club papers were written 60 years ago or more. However, there's some interesting details, they say, in these these records that must have been written in the 40s. It remains nonetheless on this hypothesis a puzzling fact that the Great Explosion of 1975 is referred to, even more precisely, the Great Storm, which actually occurred on the night of Thursday, June 12, 1987, though certain inaccuracies appear in the account given of the progress and effects of the latter event. Mr. Green has proposed to us a curious explanation of this difficulty, evidently suggested to him by the contents of the papers. The future events, he thinks, were foreseen. In our opinion, a less romantic but more probable solution is this. The paper is part of a stock purchased by a man resident in Oxford about 1940. He used the paper for his minutes, whether fictitious or founded in fact, but he did not use all his stock. Much later, after 1987, he copied out his matter again, using up the old paper. And though he did not make any general revision, he moved the dates forward and inserted the genuine references to the explosion and the storm. And that they go on to a sort of further layering of how old the writer must have been when he was making these notes. He must have been very old in 2000, and maybe it's this haunted house that we've heard of. Well, there's some kind of spooky things in there. Mr. Tolkien is playing at certain names here. The D.M. Barrow of the Institute of Occidental Languages sounds like librarian joke. But there was a famous medievalist, Francis Wormold. His son Patrick Wormold was also a medievalist in Oxford in the day. So Tolkien, he's the degree of fiction that he's weaving in here is interesting. The J.R. Titmuss reminds me of M.R. James, who was a great medievalist as well, and cataloger of manuscripts. But what's wonderful and curious is this sort of overlayering. Tolkien obviously wrote these stories in 1944 to 1946. He's told us that in his letters. He's writing on paper that he had from 1940, and then creating this preface that's supposedly found in 2012, and then trying to figure out how events described in 1987 could be accurate. The Great Storm in the story is the Great Storm that is the Atlantis story that's going to come back in, right? And then that's presumably ordinary enough, right? Except there was a Great Storm in 1987. I was there in Cambridge. It was in October, not June, but it was October 16th, and it blew over many of the great trees on the island. Well, which is it, right? Accident. I mean, it was, in fact, and Christopher even notes it in his notes for that entry. The notes in these are scattered in all different places. Let me see what he says about it. The Great Storm of June 12, 1987. My father's prevision was only out by 4 months. The greatest storm in living memory struck southern England, causing vast damage on October 16, 1987. It is curious in the light of this to read Mr. Green's remarks, quote, "It may well be that the predictions, notably of the storm, though genuine and not coincidences, were unconscious, giving one more glimpse of the strange processes of so-called literary invention with which the papers are largely concerned." Well, that's just, I mean, one, that's kind of delightful and spooky, right? But there really was a storm, and somehow Tolkien predicted it? Well, okay, so we have these papers, and it's apparently minutes from this Notion Club, and the editor in the frame, within the frame. You see how many frames we have? We have the problem of the physical paper. We have the scholars, the D.M. Barrow and W.W. Wormold, Bibliopoly and Institute of Occidental Languages, arguing over how the paper could have been used to make a record for something that happened in apparently that happened in 1987, but which is only published in 2012. If Dan Brown were doing this, you would be delighted, I'm assuming, or maybe not. But that Tolkien is doing, he's doing it out of both this scholarly whimsy of creating verisimilitude in editing, the editing process and the framing process. But he's also he's trying to do it. Well, what is he doing? Is he trying to convince himself of something more? Well, the characters are perhaps predictably a little like Tolkien's own friends, particularly like the Inklings, right? The club that actually met. Although by 1944, when he's writing these Notion Club papers, they weren't meeting in the fashion that they had. And when he mentions to Unwin that he was rewriting on fairy stories to be published in a volume in honor of the late Charles Williams, you may remember when I mentioned in the previous letter, he talks about how he and Lewis fell out after Lewis and Williams became much closer friends. There's a sorrow, I think, in his exercise here, because he is writing the kinds of conversations he had been having and wasn't anymore. Right, so there's a kind of diary and nostalgic element to his creation of these characters for the Notion Club. Although, and Christopher goes through this in his own edition, he talks about how in the manuscript Tolkien makes sort of notations on figuring out who the characters are. Raymer, our main character for today, is Michael George Raymer. He's a member of Jesus College, born 1929 in Hungary. Professor of Finno-Ugric philology, but better known as a writer of romances. His parents returned to England when he was 4, but he spent a good deal of time in Finland and Hungary between 1956 and 1968. Among his interests are Celtic languages and antiquities. For this character, who is our main character for today, Tolkien couldn't decide who he wanted him to be modeled on. And at one point in his manuscript, he writes self, and then Christopher says he crossed that out. And he wrote CSL, meaning Lewis, and crossed that out. And then TO, and I don't actually know who that is. The other ones he was a little more stable on. He has Latimer, which is T, which is a sort of joke on Latiner. He has Loudham, which is very clearly Hugo Dyson, who is always very loud. Dyson is the one who is perhaps apocryphally said to have bellowed out one point when Tolkien started reading his elf stories, not more bloody elves, right? So Dyson is there as Loudham. Franks is labeled as CSL, so that is, I think, Philip Frankley. And then Dolbear is Havard. And Dolbear we recognize as the one that was challenging Raymer in our excerpt. The others are coming in, Jeremy, Frankley, Loudham, Guildford, right? Dolbear is described as the same age as Raymer, Wadham College, born 1929, research chemist. Christopher remarks there was a chemist in the neighborhood, so maybe that was it. He has many other interests, notably philosophy, psychoanalysis, and gardening. A close friend of Raymer, he is red-haired and red-bearded and known to the club as Ruthless Rufus. We get little excerpt descriptions of the other characters. Nicholas Guildford, Lincoln, born 1937, archaeologist, the club reporter because he likes it and knows shorthand. Alwyn Arundel Loudham, BNC, born 1938, lecturer in English language, chiefly interested in Anglo-Saxon, Icelandic, and comparative philology, occasionally writes comic or satirical verse known as airy. He will become more important in the next section. Philip Franklin, Queens, born 1932, a poet, once a well-known leader, well known as a leader of the Queen meter movement, but now just a poet, still publishing volumes of collected verse, suffers from horror borealis, as he calls it, horror borealis, and is intolerant of all things northern or Germanic. He is all the same a close friend of Loudon. There's obviously layered jokes in here about exactly how much the different Inklings liked or disliked the storytelling elements that Tolkien did. And then Wilfred Trewin Jeremy, Corpus Christi, born 1942, university lecturer in English literature. He specializes in escapism and has written books on the history and criticism of ghost stories, time travel, and imaginary lands. Then there are some other characters who don't really come into the draft that we have. Finally, the youngest one, John Jethro Rashbold, JJR, Magdalene, born 1965, which I like. That's my birth year. So I'm always looking for these. I was in Cambridge in 1987 when we had the big storm, and Rashbold, who is a translation of Tolkien, Rashbold, was born 1965. He's an undergraduate classical scholar, apprentice poet, introduced by Franklin, to whom he's much attached, but he doesn't have much of a role. So, following my general rule of saying most characters in Tolkien stories are Tolkien, most characters in Tolkien stories are Tolkien, but in this fiction, whatever it is, the characters are reflecting other conversations that he's had, but it's usually that they're dealing with something that he himself wanted to struggle with. Now, what is going on in this first night? This is Thursday, February 20th, 1987, night 60. And it starts with defective at the beginning. Raymer's story is lost. So the characters are already in the middle of a conversation trying to figure out whether they like this story that Raymer has read to them, and they're discussing specifically the problem of the frame, right? So they first that he finishes reading and they sit in silence for a while, and then they start talking about whether or not they like the way in which he's given his character access to, as Dolbear has been chiding him in the excerpt that I read at the beginning, what he really wanted to tell them. Now, what was that frame? Interestingly, it was a space travel frame, right? And the characters are saying how they don't like it. It seemed fake. They weren't sure about it. And it failed, right? And thank you for that, Raymer growled. But it's just like you, Nicholas, to pick on the frame, which is an awkward necessity. A picture isn't easy to change anyway, and say nothing about what's inside it. Now, recognize how disingenuous this is, in a sense, that Tolkien, in creating these Notion Club papers, is, everything what I'm trying to get you used to is everything you read in Tolkien is basically one of those Russian dolls. It's like when you finally get to the story inside, you've gone through layers and layers of framing before you get to the story. And here he kind of knows it, and he knows how frustrating I think it must be to readers to have that, but he's also fixed on how important it is to have a frame that doesn't break at some point. And Raymer's just saying, well, fine, you can fix the frame, you can fix it, and his friends push back on him, and said, no, I thought what was inside was good, but the frame didn't work. And he says, I mean, odd coming from you, and it's setting. For you won't get away with that framed excuse. A picture frame is not a parallel. An author's way of getting to Mars, say, is part of his story of his Mars and of his universe. As far as that particular tale goes, it's part of the picture. And even if it's only in a marginal position, it may seriously affect all that's inside. So Tolkien has Raymer say, phooey, don't worry about that frame. Don't get fixed on the frame. Just, the story was, and his own character, Guildford, who's the moderator, right? He's the moderator that the Nightingale suggested and judged the song. says, no, the frame is part of it. You can't tell a good story and not expect to be challenged on what you did with the frame. And they push back a little bit more, and Guilford goes on. He says, no, I'm not talking about dislike at the moment. I'm talking about credibility. I don't like heroic warriors, but I can bear stories about them. I believe they exist, or could. I don't think spaceships do, or could. And anyway, if you pretend that they do, and use them for space journeys in the flesh, they'll land you in spaceship sort of adventures. If you're spaceship-minded and scientifictitious, or even if you let your characters be so, it's likely enough that you'll find things of that order in your new world, or only see sights that interest such folk. And they're saying, okay, but that's not true of Raymer's story. And he's like, it's generally true, all too ghastly true, said Guilford. But of course there is a way of escape into inconsistency. Discord. Remember, interestingly, Guilford was, meant to judge the song, right, of the Owl and the Nightingale. And here he's saying the frame breaks, and it damages the story if it's discordant with the story that it's telling. Raymer takes that way, like Lindsay or Lewis, and the better post-Lewis writers of this sort of thing. Now, you recognize that they're talking about Mars, right? They're talking about, in effect, the way C.S. Lewis got his hero, Ransom, to Mars in Out of the Silent Planet, right? And I said last time, it's like basically Lewis sticks Ransom in a box, flies the box to Mars, and it's like the brave little toaster. I'm sure you've seen that, right? They get in the laundry basket and the microwave powers it. It in a way, you could say it doesn't matter, right? What we really want is the adventure on Mars, and if the brave little toaster gets there in the laundry basket, why can't Ransom get there in his sort of coffin pod, and you not be worrying about the mechanism? Well, Tolkien didn't like that. He thought it was completely unsatisfying. It's probably good that he didn't publish this, because he's spending most of this discussion in Night 60 dissing Lewis for using such a clunky mechanism, right? So you can land on another world in a spaceship and then drop that nonsense if you've got something better to do there than most of the earlier writers had. But personally, I dislike that acutely. It makes the this is like science fiction-ish, scientifictitious bunkum all the worse by contrast. Crystal torpedoes. That's what Ransom travels in, right? So he's in this crystal torpedo. And back rays and levers for full speed ahead, faster than light, mark you, are bad enough inside one of those hideous magazines. Dead Sea fruit with gaudy rinds. But in, say, A Voyage to Arcturus, they are simply shocking. All the more so for being unnecessary. David Lindsay had at least two other butter methods up his sleeve: the seance connection, or the suggestion of the Dark Tower at the end. Thank goodness there wasn't, at any rate, no return by crystal torpedo in that tale. But the trick in Out of the Silent Planet, getting the hero kidnapped by spaceship villains so as to explain how an interesting man ever got inside one, was not bad, said Frankly. That's Lewis defending himself, saying it's not that bad, it did work. And the stupid villainy of the spaceship folk was essential. They behaved as such people would, and the plot depends on that. Not bad, I agree, said Guilford. Still it was, as you say, a trick, right? So what we have is Lewis and Tolkien in real life. It's tossed up for their space story and their time travel story, and Lewis did the space travel story and got it published. And now Tolkien is here niggling yet again over exactly how he could write his time travel story, and wrestling with himself about why he doesn't want the kind of mechanism that Lewis used, because then it's not really, well, what, right? It's like, and frankly, Lewis says, but the point of the story was to get them to Mars and have this other kind of adventure, and exactly why does it matter so much that the crystal torpedo is goofy? Well, not bad, I agree, said Guilford. Still it was, as you say, a trick, and not first rate, not if you want sheer literary credibility, the pure thing, rather than an alloy with allegory and satire, right? So if you just want allegory, fine. Wardrobe anyone? He doesn't actually say that, but there's the the sense that if you're just going for satire or allegory, you don't need to worry so much about your frame. You can get your characters into the alternate space regardless and carry on. Tolkien's not satisfied with that. Raymer is not after any such Lewisite alloy. And I think his device of letting an intelligent artist get into a contraption by accident, not knowing what it is a mere trick. But what I really object to in any such tale, however tinged, is the pretense that these contraptions could exist or function at all. They're indefinitely less probable as the carriers of living, undamaged human bodies and minds than the wilder things in fairy stories. But they pretend to be probable on a more material, mechanical level. It's like having to take Heath Robinson seriously. But you've got to have some kind of removal van, says Frankly, or else do without this kind of story. They may not be your sweetmeat, Nicholas, but I've got a tooth for them, and I'm not going to be done out of them by you. So, frankly, Lewis, the Lewis character, C.S. Lewis character, pushes back and says, look, if you want this kind of story, you've got to have something. You've got to have some sort of mechanism, and Raymer just isn't having any of that, and he keeps pushing back. They carry on talking about this. Let me just make sure I've got all the pieces of it. This is the problem. Again, Guildford's coming back in and saying, okay, so here's a problem. And Guildford had been, make sure I've got these characters right. Guildford had been objecting to the frame, and Frankly is trying to say, what's the big deal? If you want the story, you need it. But again, Guildford says, but if you just sort of trick your character into getting into this crystal torpedo and all you want is satire or allegory, that's fine. But if you want something else, you need a different frame, right? So we need, he says, it could be scientific or mechanical. At any rate, for anyone writing now, I admit the criteria of credibility may change, though as far as I can see, genuine science, as distinct from mechanical romance, narrows the possibility rather than expands them. But I still stick to my original point. This is Guildford still. The machine, in quotes, machine used sets the tone. I found spaceships sufficiently credible for a raw taste until I grew up and wanted to find something more useful on Mars than ray guns and faster vehicles. Spaceships will take you to that kind of country, no doubt, but I don't want to go there. There's no need now to travel to find it. No, but there is an attraction in it being far away, even if it's nasty and stupid, said Frankly. Even if it's the same, you could make a good story, inevitably satirical in effect, perhaps, but not really primarily so. Out of a journey to find a replica of Earth and its denizens, I dare say. So they're arguing and arguing and arguing. Guildford's primary point over and over again is the frame sets the tone. He doesn't like artificiality in the mechanism, and he wants something better. And then Jeremy wakes up. We're going to have him be a major character later, so we need to introduce him. But why have anything at all? Little Jeremy asked suddenly. You may be wondering this. It's like, why do you need a frame? Why can't we just start with, Frodo in the Hobbit hole and Gandalf shows up and he's like, why did we need the preface? Why do we need the appendices? Why do you need the elaborate frame that Tolkien gave the Lord of the Rings? Well, this is Tolkien wrestling with that very problem. And at one point he has Jeremy saying, well, okay, why? Why do we need that? So far he had sat curled up on the floor as near to the fire as he could get, and he had said nothing, though his black bird-like eyes had hopped to and fro from speaker to speaker. The best stories I know about imaginary times and lands are just stories about them. Why a wizard? At least, why a wizard outside the real story, just to waft you into it? Why not apply the once-upon-a-time method to space? Do you need more than an author's magic? Do you need more than author's magic? Even old Nick won't deny authors the power of seeing more than their eyes can. In his novels, he lets himself look into other people's heads. Why not into distant parts of space? It's what the author has really got to do. Why conceal it? No, of course I don't deny authors their right of invention. Scene, if you like to call that, said Guildford. This poor Dullbear, who's asleep throughout all of this, sort of stirs, and then they carry on. But they're saying over and over and over again, does the frame matter or not? Why can't you just have the story with the wizards and not worry about the frame and just say once upon a time, bammo, we're in there. And that is the point at which they sort of press, right? So Guildford says, you can't just make it all up. Who's speaking now? Frankly saying, why can't I make mine and let its laws allow spaceships? Because it won't then be your private world, of course, said Guildford. Surely that is the main point of that kind of story in an intelligent level. The Mars in such a story is Mars, the Mars that is. And the story is, as you've just admitted, a substitute for satisfaction of our insatiable curiosity about the universe as it is. So a space travel story ought to be made to fit, as far as we can see, the universe as it is. We want it to fit our reality. And so just saying, well, okay, I can say that the crystal torpedo takes him there. Why are you making such a big deal about it? And Guildford saying, no, we want it in our universe. We want it in our reality. This is the person who wrote The Lord of the Rings. This is the person whom all of you love for world building, right? As if he invented it out of nowhere, which most of you probably know Middle Earth is our planet, right? But in what sense, right? He's trying to figure out exactly how he can make any of this travel within our universe as it is. So Guildford goes on. So a space travel story ought to be made to fit, as far as we can see, the universe as it is. If it doesn't or doesn't try to, then it does become a fairy story of a debased kind. But there is no need to travel by rocket to find fairy. It can be anywhere or nowhere. But supposing you did travel and did find fairyland, asked Raymer suddenly. For some time now he'd been staring at the fire, and it seemed to take very little interest in the battle that had been going on about him. Jeremy gaped at him and jumped to his feet. But not by spaceship, surely, he cried. That would be as depressingly vulgar as the other way about. Like an awful story I came across once about some men who used a magic carpet for chief power to drive a bus. I'm glad to get you as an ally, laughed Guildford, for you're a hardened sinner. You read that bastard stuff, scientific fiction, not as a casual vice, but actually as a professional interest. The stuff is extremely interesting, said Jeremy, seldom as art. Its art level is, as a rule, very low. But literature may have a pathological side. Still, you've heard me on all that often enough. On this point, I'm with you. Real fairy stories don't pretend to produce impossible mechanical effects by bogus machines. This may also explain to you why Tolkien has so little magic in The Lord of the Rings. He hates magic as mechanism. Completely unlike, for example, J.K. Rowling's in Harry Potter stories, right, where the magic that the students and the wizards perform is basically science done, remotely or something. Potions is chemistry, and they do study a little bit. But what Tolkien desperately disliked, any sense of mechanism that just gets dropped in there. And as Jeremy is saying, real fairy stories don't pretend to produce impossible mechanical effects by bogus machines. No, and if frankly wants fairy tales with mechanized dragons and quack formulas for producing power swords or anti-dragon gas or scientific fictitious explanations of invisibility, well, he can have them and keep him. No, for landing on a new planet, you've got your choice. Miracle, magic, or sticking to normal probability, the only known or likely way in which anyone has ever landed on a world. Oh, so you've got a private recipe all the time, have you? Said Raymer sharply. No, it's not private, though I've used it once. Well, come on, what is it? Incarnation, by being born, said Guildford. Now, at this is where we come into the passage I read at the beginning. Dolbear wakes up and challenges Raymer, saying, we've been talking about this problem of your frame all along, but there's something inside that frame that you didn't make up. And if you consider that all along now, Tolkien, as our outside frame author, has been wrestling with the problem not just of how do you convince the reader of your invention, but in fact, how don't you trick the reader, right? I don't want this to be a trick. I don't want, I mean, the examples he gives, I don't want, mechanized dragons, power swords, like lightsabers, anybody, or anti-dragon gas, right? We don't want just machines that operate by magic, or as you say, bogus machines. We want something that fits in our universe as it is and does more than just trick the reader into accepting that we're now in this improbable place, right? We want it probable and we want it real. And when Dolbear challenges Raymer and saying, that frame you made, that seemed the part you made up. What's inside it? Raymer says, there is such a world, and I saw it once. We looked at him for a long while. All of us, except Dolbear, I think, felt some alarm and pity, and on the surface of our minds, blank incredulity, of course, yet it was not quite that. We did not feel the underlying emotion of incredulity, for apparently all of us, in some degree, had sensed something odd about that story, and now recognized that it differed from the norm, like seeing does from imagining. I felt, this is Nicholas writing, I felt like it was like the difference between a bright glimpse of a distant landscape, thread-like waters really falling, wind ruffling the small green leaves and blowing up the feathers of birds on the branches, as that can be seen through a telescope, limited but clear and colored, flattened and remote, but moving and real, between that and any picture. Not, it seemed to me, an effect to be explained simply by art, and yet the explanation offered was nonsense outside the pages of a romance, or so I found that most of us felt at that moment. They tried pressing Raymer a bit more, frankly reads them a story that they didn't like, and saying it appeared as the opening poem of his 1989 volume Experiments in Pterodactylics. We broke up and go on, and Loudon pushes Raymer at the end, saying, we want more news from nowhere. And Raymer says, I did not say it was nowhere, only that it was somewhere. Well, yes, I'll come. Okay, so we have that's the night 60, right? And then they come back the next night, and Raymer explains a bit more exactly what he's been up to. And they're right. They were right to sense that the something that he'd seen, that he described for them inside, was real, and that's that Guilford reflecting on that whatever it was, I felt like it was a difference between a bright glimpse of a distant landscape, that Raymer had actually seen something, not that he had just taken his imagination and crafted a landscape and described it, that he had somehow seen it, as if from afar, as if somehow he had been using a sort of telescope. Well, then he explains that he was actually trying to do something more specific, that he wanted to see things, he wanted to write about what Lewis called now, right? And again, this is a reference to the Out of Sight Plan. I wanted to see things in places on a grand scale. That was one thread. This is the next night. So they've come back, and now Raymer is going to have to admit what he's been up to. And he's going to give them a full explanation of exactly the theory that he's working on, to be able to see that somewhere that he's written into the story as if it were a fictional place, but it is actually a somewhere. So he wanted to see things on a grand scale. That was one thread. Another thread was dreams. And that had a literary origin too, partly because Rufus and I, Dolbear, have long been interested in dreams, especially in their story and scene making, and in their relation to waking fiction. But as far as I could judge such things, it did seem to me that a pretty good case had been made out for the view that in dream, a mind can, and sometimes does, move in time. I mean, can observe a time other than that occupied by the sleeping body during the dream. And frankly says, well, of course, we can imagine other times. And Raymer says, no, that's not that. I mean, moving not by memory or by calculation or by invention, as the waking mind can be said to move. This is not just I'm sitting here now in Chicago in 2020 and I'm thinking about Tolkien writing this story in 1944. But Raymer means, no, I mean it more as a problem of perception, right? So not imagination, but seeing. I see these things. I in my dream, I can see other times. But as a perceiver of the external, of something new that is not yet in the mind. So it's not just that I have images that I have accessed previously that I've seen in real life and then mix them up and turn them into a new story, but I'm seeing something in my dream in times that I have not ever seen in waking life, and they're real. For if you can see in other times than the time of dreaming what you never saw in waking life, so that it is not in your memory, seeing the future, for instance, would be a clear case, and it cannot reasonably be doubted that that occurs. Then obviously there is a possibility of real first-hand seeing of what is not there, not where your body is. Not even your eyes, said Raymer. That is, of course, a point. It's probably, I shall come to that later, it's probably a case of translation, but leave it for a bit. I was thinking of dreaming chiefly, though I don't suppose the possibility is really limited to that state. Only if you live in a never-ending racket of sense impressions, other than more distant noises have to be very loud to be heard. And this movement or transference of observation, it is clearly not limited to other time. It can occur in other space or in both. A dreamer is not confined to the events of other time occurring in his bedroom. What is he talking about? He's saying there's movement, that you can move in time and see for real things in your dreams. And then he goes on to sort of build up different elements of this theory, right? So he says, I think actually it's clear that the mind can be in two places at one time, two or more. Once you've made it more than one, the figure is perhaps not very important. For I suppose as far as the mind goes, you can't get nearer to saying where it is than to say where its attention is. And that, of course, may be decided by various causes, internal and external. You can get a sort of literary parallel. When you're writing a story, for instance, you can, if you're a vivid visualizer, as I am, and are clearly visualizing a scene, see two places at once. You can, say, see a field with sheep and a tree and sheep, sheltering from the sun under it, and be looking around your room. You're really seeing both scenes because you can recollect details from another. And then he's talking more about his visualization and how it works. Often, he says, there's no trace of composing a scene or building it up. I find it difficult, usually quite impossible, to alter these pictures to suit myself, and that is my waking purpose. As a rule, I find it better, in the end more right, to alter the story I'm trying to tell to suit the pictures, if the two really belong together. They don't always, of course. But in any case, on such occasions, you are really seeing double or simultaneously. You tend to associate the two views, inner and outer, though the juxtaposition of them usually is their only connection. I still associate a view of a study I no longer possess, and a pile of blue and yellow covered exam scripts, long burnt, I hope, with the opening scene of a book I wrote years ago, A Great Moraine High Up in the Barren Mountains. And his sort of, okay, he's going to reiterate this over and over again. He's saying the same thing several times. The mind can be in more than one place at a given time, but it is more properly to be said where its attention is. To go back to dreams. Of course, the memory of such true dreams or free dreams is notoriously rarish and chancy, and also scrappy as a rule. But it is not legitimate. It is pretty plainly wrong to assume that what is ordinarily remembered by ordinary people of their dreaming is either most of the total or the most important part of it. And the will to remember can be strengthened, and the memory can be enlarged. Rufus has had a good deal of experience in that direction, and he's helped me from time to time. And then frankly says, aha, so he actually knew something about it. And Dolbear says, well, I haven't the faintest idea what Michael is driving at yet, if that's what you mean. Or rather, I understand what he's saying and more or less agree with it, but what has it to do with that kind of vision of what it was? Imbaru, said Raymer. I don't yet see, Dolbear ended. Now, that is a lot to take in. We're going to stop. I'm going to stop reading in the middle now, but I want you to consider all of the different layers of things that Tolkien has now suggested. He's saying that there is, he's saying he's writing a time travel story. He's saying in the framing that he gave his own, his editor's own discovery of this bundle of papers, that there is a kind of embedded scholarly framing into discovering whatever it is going on in these papers. And within the story, he has his characters talking about the problem of creating a story that is not just, I think it's interesting, it's not just that it's persuasive to the reader that you're seeing something, but Tolkien seems to be wanting to convince himself that what he sees, remember what he told Christopher in the opening to this problem, that I have been gaining a lot of new ideas about prehistory via Beowulf and other sources of which I may have written, and I want to work them into the long-shelved time travel story I began. He is apparently trying to convince himself that it's possible to travel in time. What could he have possibly meant? To be continued.